It's Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs. Let's start the show with Lewis Tennant. Here we go. The guests and interviews that you're looking for with creators, innovators, and so much more. For all episodes and further info, verbalhighs.com is the place to go.
The intro was going well, but then my creepy neighbour came out and he threw me. I don't think he even saw me, but he threw me. It's like the baby with one big eyebrow from The Simpsons, which would make me Maggie. Welcome to Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs, a podcast podcasted from a kitchen bench in Kingsland, Auckland, New Zealand, aside from Mr. Creepy, who's out tinkering on his creepmobile. It's very quiet around here, almost like a public holiday, because I guess essentially between Christmas and New Year's, they all are, aren't they? The crane's stopped. The building site's been out of action for over a week. Not sure who's going to clear our bins. That's becoming a bit of a health and safety issue, but everyone's resting. That's the main thing. Another thing about this time of the year is concept of time sort of becomes very malleable, in that I talked to my guest today just before Christmas, and that seems like a very, very, very long time ago, but it's probably just only over a week ago. His name's Paul. He was a fascinating and fun guest, and some guests more than others, you know, you make a more of a connection with, kind of kindred spirits or what have you. Paul seemed to express the same at the end, that he'd really enjoyed having a chat. He wasn't sure what to expect at the beginning, because he actually came to me via a listener recommendation. Shouts to Ben. Ben's Paul's cousin. Ben, I Facebook snooped you, and I know who you are, Ben. I think we went to uni together. Does that sound right? Anyway, Paul made a film about 100 men that he has slept with. Perhaps not actually fallen asleep with, but you get the general drift. 100 is not his whole list by any means, as he goes into in the episode, but it's a great concept. Of course, on its own, probably wouldn't have held an audience as much as the story that Paul builds around it, which is about a whole bunch of stuff, changing attitudes to sexuality, particularly homosexuality, a history of, I guess, gay men, a personal history of Paul's own love story, which goes hand in hand with the 100 sojourns. So we're talking about open relationships. It's also about how technology affects technological change affects people and communities. Most notably, I guess, Grindr versus more public spacings of the past. But we mull about that topic in more general terms as well. As I say, it's a good convo. I'll just you don't want to hear me bang on about it at the beginning. You just want to hear it, right? Well, I hope you do. Well, if you've made it this far, I assume you do. Okay, like the show, Verbal Highs Podcast on Facebook, Verbal Highs on Twitter. You can subscribe on iTunes and leave a rating. Some really big shows only have a few ratings, and so I've sort of got a boutique but really connected audience in that I've got 20 ratings, which is a lot considering my numbers, as I say, aren't as high as many offshore podcasts by a long shot. And a lot of those have less, so thanks for taking the time. Christmas was great. One of the most relaxing Christmases ever. I love my family, always have, but families, you know, families are families. Families know how to press your buttons. Families have histories. Families have dynamics. But this time around, we just chilled, man. We just chilled. My great uncle, who's sort of worldview stopped in about 1972, and who once said at another Christmas that he had more information on his bookshelf than that damn internet, managed to say a similar thing about email. And I bit, but then I let go fairly quickly, so that was about as dramatic as it got. We're on the Coromandel. That's a pretty good space for for said chilling. Thank you, Paul, for coming in. And to everyone who listens, I really hope you enjoy this conversation. It's a good one.
This is Dr. Tennant's Verbal Highs.
Rather than the person on the other side interviewing or whatever.
Although you were, what's the expression in documentary making? It was a performative documentary, so it's not like you didn't...
That was cleverly edited.
What do you mean by that?
Oh, well, you take out all the fluffs and things that don't work. And, I hate being filmed, and I've never done it before, but, the Film Commission quite rightly said, because you're talking about 100 men, presumably.
Yeah.
I mean, the Film Commission said, you tell me when you want to start, because shall I just keep rabbiting?
We're
going.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
Okay, right. The Film Commission said, originally when I was going to do it, I wasn't even going to be in it, because I literally have never been in front of a camera and hate even being photographed.
Yeah. And
the Film Commission quite rightly said, look, this isn't going to work if you don't sort of front up and own it. So I had to. Well,
it would be an odd film in that it's so personal and the very premise. If you weren't there, I've stolen this, as often I do with intros. My guest Paul Oremland began directing a run of docos and 2 feature films during almost 3 decades, based in London. Since returning home, I think about 10 years ago.
Yep.
He has continued to work as an editor and director, including on said 2017 autobiographical documentary 100 Men.
Indeed.
Which I watched last night and very much enjoyed.
Okay, thank
you. And one of the first things I thought about 15 minutes in, perhaps, is, God's New Zealand's small, because I already knew someone in the top 100.
Yikes. Indeed it is small, and I'm wondering who this is now.
James.
I thought it might be James. Yeah, James is well. James is fabulous, and I've known him for many years, and in fact, the documentary came about partly in a way because I just wanted to. I started interviewing people that I wanted to do documentaries on, and James was somebody that I actually thought could warrant a whole documentary. His life is so interesting,
I don't know a lot about him, but from what he said and what he sort of hints at in the film, he's had he's kind of come from a hard man, very kind of straight gang background where he's negotiated that.
Absolutely.
And his sexuality, which is an interesting story in itself. So the premise of the film, I'll get you to describe it. What is it that you set out to make and then did make?
Well, it sort of was organic in that I arrived back in New Zealand and had some time. I was trying to develop another feature film, and I literally started to list all the men that I'd had sex with, of which there are quite a few, being honest, partly because I just didn't want to forget them. I've met so many amazing people, and I also realised that over the years I've been filming, as I said, people that I wanted to feature in documentaries, and my documentary work overlaps, I guess, my real life, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it just grew from there, and in a way, talking to producers, they suddenly said, look, this could be an interesting way to approach history, which I love. And it was suggested to the Film Commission. They took an interest in it, and suddenly it became real. So it's a way of, exploring 40 years of personal history, or history through a personal approach. It's basically tracking down people, talking to them, people ex-shags, so to speak.
Yeah. But like any doco, as you well know, you've got your kind of literal subject matter, and then you've got obviously kind of wider themes and so on. So it's very much about the history of the gay male with you and friends at the centre. It's just changing attitudes to homosexuality in a wider sense, which I'll get to later on. It's about, to me anyway, it was about just societal change in general, with things like how we're going from an analogue to a digital world, which I actually, I've thought about a lot in a number of capacities. But for you, you got to, I think, Auckland Uni and started some kind of degree, but then abandoned that, as people often do when they realise what they should be doing, and decided to become a filmmaker. When was that? In the 1970s?
Oh, you're going to give away my real age as opposed to my grinder age.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, look, I grew up in the 70s in New Zealand,
Yeah.
and it was a very different place. And I fell in love with films, partly struggling with all the angst of being gay, which we explore in the doco a little bit.
Yeah.
And just partly, I wandered into a cinema and it was just so spectacular and fell in love with it. In those days, there was very little happening in New Zealand. It was a totally different landscape.
It was the National Film Unit. That was about it. Governmental trained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually joined a thing called the Auckland Alternative Co-op, I think it was, run by Jeff Stephen, who became a mentor and is still a good friend, and learned how to edit films, made a little tiny film with a character called David Blythe, who's still around, and then I sort of felt, look, I wanted to explore the world. England seemed to be a place where there was more going on, and I fell in love with somebody, and we just left, and I went to London, so to speak. So I was about 21, 22.
And what was the New Zealand like that you left in the 1970s? Although your grinder age is 23 and you don't look a day over it.
Thank you. New Zealand was just a totally different place. I mean, it was just. Look, and not. I think it's interesting because New Zealand's always had a sort of streak of, I don't know, alternative, and even back then, I think there were things that. There was a whole hippie community in Coromandel that I remember going down to visit, and there was an exciting gay rights movement starting here. But overall, it was, I remember when I came out, all my friends at university, ex-school friends, it's changed now, but at the time they were scared to take their shirts off in front of me.
Right.
That's the sort of world
in case they catch the gay.
Yeah. And look, they remain good friends, and we've become good friends.
Yeah.
And I think the whole world has changed, and changed hugely, which is partly what the doco was about. It was an unusual approach to take, and it didn't. It was quite hard, and a lot of people attacked me for it. So it wasn't entirely, it was
for this current doco that we're kind of mainly discussing.
Yeah. So attitudes have changed, but. Not entirely.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that later as well. I wondered what you're saying with New Zealand. I always wondered why, because they're both colonies. I've lived in Australia for a number of years, so I'm not going to say they're the same for a second as countries, but there are similarities. I always wondered, my impression of the gay lot, as it were, in Australia was that things were more progressive there earlier, and I wondered kind of why that was. Something you just said just sparked that in me. Or are they similar either?
I spent time in Australia, and I think to be honest with you, it's partly just density of numbers.
I was thinking that as I was going, London,
Sydney, and I've never really taken to Sydney. I think the scene's quite harsh there, and it's also hugely changed. But back then, I went to Melbourne before travelling to London, and spent a year in Melbourne, and the scene there was fascinating, and I think it's just. The number of people, it's just a sheer density.
Yeah, so pockets become bigger pockets. Yeah, I get that.
And, one of the things back then was there was very much a sense of, not ghetto, but I guess, people congregated in certain areas, and Melbourne, even back then, had quite a strong community that was very important.
So you get to London, terrifying and exciting as that is, when I did it. What are your first kind of moves there? You determined to get film work?
Yes, I struggled straight away. I mean, that was my dream, ambition, passion. Yeah. But it was also just an amazing, I'd grown up in New Zealand and in Glendowie, went to Glendowie College, a very ordinary, middle of the road sort of school. Had a bunch of friends, and a slightly odd upbringing in that, I was brought up in a very religious, sort of fundamentalist Christian world, so I was a little sheltered. I mean, not totally, but, I'd never drunk, taken dope, or, And then I arrived in London, and in a way, growing up gay, I'd sort of read about, and I talk about this in the film, I'd read about all sorts of exciting things. I'd explored in literally Auckland Library. I'd, discovered books by William Burroughs and John Genet or John Ricci, a wonderful American gay writer. And then suddenly I was in a world that I'd read about. It was like London was just it took a while. It wasn't immediate, but I think in about a year, I ended up, partly exploring my dreams of making films, but as a byproduct of that, I ended up working in a little sex cinema in the heart of Soho, and that was a total revelation. I was an innocent kid from, New Zealand, Auckland, Christian religious upbringing, and suddenly I'm in the heart of Soho's red light district, which at those days was pretty wild.
I never thought about that side of it when it's it's talked about in the film and so on. Yeah, just how kind of fish out of water you were in that scenario.
I think
I'm sure you're able to play up on that a few times.
Yeah, and I think in a way it was partly the fact I was so innocent that it was a sort of rose-tinted. I didn't even think about, I don't know, the dangers. And there were some, but I certainly didn't really. I mean, it was just a crazy world. I mean, it was run by gangsters. It was there were the most amazing, colourful characters, but it was also plunging into a gay culture that had grown over many years. There was, tradition that goes back to the days of Oscar Wilde, little secret clubs, and it was still very underground when I first arrived in England, which was 1979. But there was all sorts of interesting cultures, and working in this little gay sex shop, I was exposed to them. I mean, there was a whole language that existed called Polari, which was like a famous gay slang. And the guys in the sex shop actually used it. And it was just this amazing.
That's touched on in the film at the end, isn't it?
It is briefly, yeah. But it's died now, but it's such a shame. And, it was literally a secret language, and I loved it. All the queens in the sex shop, you'd come in and it would be, can't remember some of the words, but dolly and latte, I think, was legs. But anyhow,
and so there would have surely by the 70s been a albeit very stripped down version of that in New Zealand, but you just hadn't discovered it, because I think you said something hilarious like before you left you were dutifully balancing cruising in the church.
Yeah, I'd started to explore it. I mean, there was one gay nightclub back then in Auckland called Backstage, which is really giving away my age, but
that's about the same now, isn't it?
Well, interestingly, and in a way that's partly what that's the interesting and sad thing. There was only one gay club, but there were actually 3 gay saunas, whereas now there's 2.
Yeah.
And there were actually 2 other gay bars, or 3 gay bars. Now I think there's 1.5. But but the thing is, it was also very underground. I mean, Backstage was, I think, one of the few places in Auckland at that time that was open late. So it was a cool place to go. It was, and it wasn't just gay people that went there. And that was always, I think, replicated when I went to London, in the sense that many of the cool places to go, there was.
I get what you're saying. I found it analogous, and for good reason, because there's a lot of crossover. I found it analogous with the whole underground dance scene for the past 30 or 40 years. Similar trajectories with clubs and what's happened and changes and.
Absolutely, and indeed that was also, going to London, there was crossover there. There were, I loved music, and I remember going to the Marquee, and I actually met a wonderful little French guy in the Marquee, of all places.
Has he got a number in the film?
Yes, he has. Yes, he has. I can't remember the actual number, but French punk number, whatever it was. And but there were also, there were other dance clubs. The punk scene had a sort of gay crossover, and it was an exciting melting pot, and again, even on an artistic level, I ended up making early films about people like Andy the Furniture Maker, but I met Derek Jarman, and that punk gay crossover was, and then there was this constant. I mean, this was the other thing about London. It was just so layered in terms of tribes and types of people, and all of that was imbued with history. There was the skinheads, which were frightening, but then suddenly there emerged the gay skinheads as a sort of
that was a part of history. I wasn't aware of that when I saw that in the film, that there was kind of like almost like an ironic middle finger to the actual skinheads through a gay skinhead scene emerging.
It was absolutely huge, and then again crossed over to certain clubs. There was a place called the Bell in King's Cross, which was like super cool indie place where you had gay skinheads meeting with punks, and then whatever else. But it was very much like, it was sort of similar to there was a thing called Clones from America, which was this sort of like pastiche on the all-American Marlboro man. So, the idea of gay men with big moustaches and checked shirts grew out to some extent of a sort of, as you say, finger up to the Marlboro man.
Yeah.
Well, the British equivalent was the sort of gay skinhead. And it was a huge thing. It was a sexual thing as well. There was sexual fetish sort of scene and all of that. But it was very much political as well. I mean, it was... And then it became complicated, and you got... in those days, and this was, early 80s, so Thatcher was sort of like emerging as a force, and there was all sorts of politics swirling around, and then you had, I remember there were, gay skinheads who'd been in the National Front who turned out, realised they were gay, and there was a very famous one called Nicky Crane who became the poster boy and then came out, and it was an interesting time.
That footage of Thatcher, for anyone who sort of, it was great. It was a great reminder for me. I remember Thatcher as a child, learnt more about her as I've got older. But that footage, it's like for anyone who goes, so what was so wrong with Margaret Thatcher anyway? You've only got to watch what you included in the film, really, to get a sense of a whole lot of things in that era, right?
Yeah, look, and it's interesting given the times that we are in now, I think...
Full circle.
Full circle, Thatcher certainly wasn't dumb, unlike perhaps, the current president of the US.
He's not listening.
I'm sure he's not listening. But yeah, but there is definitely...
Well, maybe he is listening.
There's definitely interesting parallels,
Yeah.
Full circle maybe, but
Look, what I did last night as I watched the film is I just sort of jotted down wee things as they interest me. So because the film's a chronological trip through your life, so it's a sort of handy way to navigate this. So strikes matches away from him. I'm like, was that actually?
Yeah, I was.
But it wasn't a campaign or anything. It was just street level knowledge.
It was a throwaway. You're talking about how it literally happened. I was sitting as a sort of 16-year-old kid in a classroom, struggling, hiding the fact that I was gay. In those days, it was impossible to come out. You were just ostracised, and it was a huge taboo. There was no. And the school teacher that was taking, whatever the equivalent of sex ed or sex education or whatever it was, I can't remember what we called it back then, sort of said, and there's this thing called
eternal hell and damnation.
Yeah,
That's what that.
But he just said, and homosexuals, I remember sitting there being told, the way to tell homosexuals is they can't whistle and they strike matches away from themselves. And I was thinking, shit, I can't whistle. I'm not sure how I strike matches.
Go home and quickly get a box out of the cupboard and check the lay of the land.
But this was the school teacher.
Yeah, I know. It's dark.
Yeah, and at the time I was 16 and
impressionable and worried and
confused and
trying to find
trying to give my life to God to make me straight, and all the other things. But and it's wonderful to think that, hopefully there are no school teachers wandering around preaching that still.
I was at high school in the late 80s to early 90s, and I will never forget there was still a dictionary knocking around our school that had... Actually, I was just thinking before I tell this story, it's quite funny that a bunch of boys must have decided to look up masturbation. But it had bodily self-pollution.
Oh God!
As the only description. Are you starting to get like a bit bothered by the sun there?
Yeah.
You want to just pull that cable there?
You keep talking.
That's right. I'm good at talking. The next thing I was gonna just bring it all the way down. The next thing I wanted to ask you, which is a real question that I think's begged from the film, and it's kind of it's a production and planning question. The process of approaching these 100 people. Were there some people that just said no fucking way? Were there other people that were like, I'd like to do it, but I can't for this reason? Or what was the
look? Absolutely. There were, and. There were lots of people that I would have loved to have been in it who said no for all sorts of reasons. And obviously, a lot of the people I would have loved to have included, I couldn't track down.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think one of the criticisms that I've read online of the film is that there weren't enough black people in it, and that's purely.
Why are you reading these?
And well, you do, and and that's purely because there were 2 or 3 friends of mine who had sort of kept in touch, and one of them just said no, and then another one I couldn't track down, which is a great shame because he was from Jamaica and had fled Jamaica to escape. He was literally an official refugee and had got in as a gay man into the UK, so it would have been great to have had his story. But I think one of the other people who turned me down, and this goes to the heart of the film, is there was a guy that I knew very well, and he, we'd had a great time and done all sorts together, and he has now become...
including some bodily self-pollution.
Indeed, and more. But, he'd become headmaster, and he was openly gay, he was married, he'd married a guy and all of that, and he was just worried about, what his colleagues... because in a way he's become respectable. And I think that's one of the things that I was trying to explore in the film. And he just sort of said, look, and some people sort of said, look, I'll do it, but I don't want to talk about, what we'd got up to.
Yeah, sure. Which you don't anyway. No. And which would have been a really not a great creative decision.
Well, really. It would have been a porn film, which would have been fun to make, and I'm happy to talk about it.
Well, look, even outside of whether it's gay, straight, bi, whatever. Specifically whether it's gay. It's a decision for anyone to make about their sex life to appear on camera, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, and look, that's something I think, it's better doing rather than talking about, and as I said, that wasn't, and obviously this is a film that one hopes will appear in a relatively wide world, although, and it's interesting talking to you, and I'm assuming you're straight, I have no idea, but in a way, and I'm thrilled that you seem to like it and have engaged in it, but obviously it was very much aimed at a gay male audience, and many of those, particularly the older, and I've toured a bit with it to festivals and the big gay festivals, they loved it and really relate to it. I've had both criticism, and in a way it's very interesting. The criticism goes to the heart of what the film is about, in that once being gay was very much you were automatically an outsider. Yeah. And in many ways that opened up worlds. It meant that my whole view of the world, I was brought up in a fairly conservative, middle class, middle of the road.
I get what you're saying. You're one way or another, you're alternative by your very sexual
nature,
orientation.
And that, in a way... The other.
Yeah.
And that allowed me to explore politically, emotionally, friendship-wise, wonderful range of experiences and people. Which
that totally came across in the film. That's what I'm saying. It reminded me of just alternative culture in general.
That's right.
Yeah.
Whereas the interesting thing is that now, and it's fantastic to see the acceptance and genuine friendships that exist between, a conversation like you and I are having would have probably been unthinkable when I was growing up.
Yeah.
On both sides, because I think, I remember being almost scared and assuming that people would hate you for being gay, so you hid it. But at the same time, there is new pressure, and particularly younger people. And I remember in one festival in Los Angeles, we had what do you call it, drinks afterwards, and there were a bunch of people talking about the film. And there was one young guy who didn't see me standing behind him. He was talking to a bunch of older guys, and he was saying, well, the film was interesting as a history, but I feel sad that people had to live like that. Now that we're normal, we can get married and we don't have to be promiscuous. And that was just like... And that was partly youth, and he believed in love forever.
I feel like that came out more towards the end. I mean, I've only seen it once, but I felt like there's a number of topics, but that really felt almost like that was at the end, because that could almost open up a whole nother documentary topic for you.
And look, you have to be very careful, because we're talking about
subjectivity.
And we're talking about the Western world. Yeah. We're not talking about whole swathes of, countries throughout Africa, even in South America. There's and across Europe. I mean, I managed to get to Poland, but, life is very different for people there. Yeah. But, and I guess I made 100 Men, and in a way, it is targeted to gay men, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. I've always believed in the ghetto to some extent, and there's, in a way, I think the experience, and I'm not saying, the experience for everybody is different, but there is, it's very interesting because, the subject of promiscuity, 100 men, and let's me be honest, 100 was a selection of considerably more.
Yeah.
And in some ways, the levels of promiscuity are vastly different between, and it's just a lifestyle. I don't know.
Well, also, I mean, as any male will tell you, I've talked about this with gay and straight friends, it's the male sex drive as well. I mean, that's at the heart of it. Well, I mean, yeah.
Yeah. And look, and men and women are different, and I think,
or maybe the male sex drive. You know what I'm meaning? I think it is the sex drive, or the whatever. Yeah.
Look, there's this whole, this idea that men can have sex without emotion. Women want more emotional thing, but I think it's it's much more complicated than that. And I think in some ways, and it's not better or worse. It's just what it is. And there's always been pressure to conform, and in a way those pressures are slightly different. Yet when I'm taught and meet young gay people now, I don't see any difference. And there's still, now, I mean, there was a period during the 80s and 90s where, there was obviously a horrible disease. Now that's less of a killer. And also, there's this new thing called PrEP, which, prevents you contracting the HIV virus. Yeah. And suddenly, I can go to, the sauna here in Auckland on orgy night, and there'll be sort of, 60, 70 guys fucking like rabbits.
Yeah.
And what's different? Nothing. And they're young.
That's another strong theme through the film, if not one of the core themes, is your enduring partnership with a single gentleman,
John
of these 100. And when you talked to other subjects in the film, people in the film, about the idea of monogamy and so on, I heard what you guys were saying, but at the same time, what about the universal human emotion of jealousy?
Look,
I think that's a pretty...
Oh, look, and this was, this is absolutely... what I'm trying to say about things are different.
I'm talking about, but folks, sorry, the bit of there is the sort of ongoing open relationship. Yeah,
open relationships, absolutely. Yeah. And it's really interesting because, I don't know of, and again, I'm not suggesting I'm not suggesting that the answer is to be promiscuous or anything. And there are monogamous, and in fact, in the film, we talk to somebody who was monogamous and says this is the way they want to live. I don't know of a single long-term gay relationship that isn't open.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of gay relationships.
Yeah.
I know some older gay men, and I find it even myself, I've now sort of reduced it to, a bunch of close fuck buddies, and that's cool, and, I'm older and happy with that.
Yeah.
But there are some older gay men who literally have done it so much that they almost sort of got to the point where, I guess they're like an old married couple. It's like, I don't know, once a year on Christmas and
so
Easter.
Now after this, I've got to ponder the fact that I thought I was just jealous by my nature, but it might be a straight social construct.
I just, look, and again, the straight world is. I think the relationship between men and women is so different and is so complicated and probably more interesting. The thing about, gay sex, it's easy. I'm on Grindr, you can meet somebody straight away.
Yeah.
You tend to have sex and then discover their name.
Yeah.
You have coffee after sex, not before.
Yeah.
All those things are, in a way it's got faster because of the internet.
Yeah.
And, it's sort of... But the open relationship, in terms of jealousy, yes, and when I first met John, there was a period of time in which, we were unfaithful and there were all sorts of issues, and we worked through those. But I think you learn and navigate, and this is what, again, I'm worried about. There's this new morality that seems to have emerged with acceptance and, the idea of marriage.
I get it. It came across, yeah.
Yeah. And
you're kind of, just to oversimplify it, you're sort of feeling like maybe straight values are being
Yeah.
adopted by young gay men.
Yeah, and you know, that's, you know, it's always been the way. And
Yeah.
look, part of that is also, you know, I was talking to a guy on Grindr the other day, and, you know, literally last night actually, and, you know, and he was messaging and saying, I'm visiting from America, I'd love to meet you, I'm, you know, 5 doors away, and da-da-da-da, but I shouldn't because I got my boyfriend coming over, and, you know, we're supposed to, and I said, look, I'm in an open relationship, but, you know, it's up to you. And he said, no, we're not in an open relationship. And I just thought, I bet they haven't been together for very long. And sure enough, they've been together for 6 months.
Your old hand.
Yeah, you know, 6 months in, it's all love. And
So oversimplification, things like Grindr are the reason that the bars are closing that you talk about, just because people aren't going out to meet each other?
look, it's a common...
Not that everyone goes out, you know, but...
Yeah, and that network of clubs and bars and saunas, and, you know, that is definitely on the decline worldwide.
Surely cruising is now as well. I used to have a friend who used to leave us after quite long nights, and I'd say, oh, that's an advantage you have over me. But I can't see that the park would trump the app these days, would it?
Oh, some people still. Some people still enjoy the old park, and
Yeah.
you know that
In conjunction with the app. In conjunction with the app.
You see
You've got
people.
GPS positioning.
You see people wandering around with their phones in their hand, wandering around the park. Yeah, no, that happens. You see that at the sauna, actually.
That's people playing that Pokemon Go game.
Of course, definitely. Look, it's a combination. I mean, I think there's also... I mean, one of the other big problems is literally the gentrification of the inner city. I mean,
Yeah, it speaks to so many... Yeah, I get it.
I mean, you know, all those wonderful places where, you know, you could have ghettos and communities because it was cheap, you know, rundown places, they're all gone. And so I think it's a combination of the internet, very much, inner cities becoming too expensive, and, you know, theoretically the acceptance of gay people into, you know, mainstream world. Well, I think that's less of an issue. I think it's just, as you say, the internet definitely, and the expense.
Yeah, right. So let's get back to your career for a bit.
I did have a career as well as you know, combining the two's a one-off.
Yeah. So you got the job at the sex shop in Soho.
It was part-time. I was still working as an assistant editor at the time and learning. It was in those days cutting on 16mm film.
But was it? I don't know if this was a bit of narrative license, but your first film gig in London was cutting the money shots out of gay porn owing to the laws.
Yeah.
So they'd have the extended version, but if the police... I didn't quite get that bit in the film. If the police raided, the edited versions would be swapped.
More or less.
Yeah.
In fact, it was more... It was, you know, more... I don't know, graphic's not the right word. More straightforward than that. What happened was... I mean, being honest, I was actually working as an assistant editor. You know, I was actually working for the BBC, what's called syncing up rushes, which is where you combine... In those days, the sound was on a separate, what's called mag track, and I was combining the two.
Yeah.
And I was doing that in a little garret-type place in Soho, and then had wandered into one of the many sex shops below that, got to know the owner, and he said, oh, you can edit film? And I said, yes. And the films in those days were screened as 16mm on projectors. And the police, he paid protection money to the police. As a result of that, they would give him warnings of the raid. So before the raid, he would bring all the reels up to me. I would take out... It was illegal to show cum shots. I mean, you know, that was what was illegal. I'd strip them all out. The raid would happen. He'd bring the reels back up. I'd put all the cum shots back in. That
rule for pornography endured in the UK for decades. It was different to the rest of Europe, I'm pretty sure.
It was, you know, things were definitely looser, and, you know, we all used to travel to Amsterdam for our weekends, and London was, I mean, it was interesting because I was talking about how back conservative New Zealand was. London was also very conservative, but there was a sort of a much bigger, sorry, I hit the microphone again, much bigger alternative world underground, and it was much more established, and, you know, I mean, I think there was an innocence, and it's interesting, porn. I mean, you look at the films that we were screening, and, I mean, you know, there was sex, but, I mean, these days, you know, 2 clicks of a button, everything's available, you know, and there are whole
I mean, that's. I mean, to me, it's sort of moving away from your story. But yeah, I won't. I'm no prude, but I do worry that, what you can find accidentally now when you're 12 is something that my grandmother will go to her grave never having seen. And I think there's something really powerful and full on in that.
There's something, I don't know, almost sad, because I like the sort of, the idea of discovering things and gently, this is a bit naughty, let's explore this. Yeah. Whereas now it's like...
So in my instance, like a joke when I've talked about this with friends, like a boob and some pubic hair, that being pornography at 14.
Yeah. But that was sort of... no, totally. And, I refer to it in the film, there was this wonderful magazine, and I'm obviously older than you, but there was this thing called Health and Beauty or something, which was a sort of, these naked people playing tennis, and this was sort of like, and this was... Whereas...
Air freighted from Denmark.
Definitely. And that was sort of like, I don't know, it was exploring those things, whereas I do, I guess, I always am amazed that young people manage to navigate the sort of...
Here's my dilemma. I see huge danger in any government or similar organisation censoring the internet.
Yes. Yes.
But then with something like that, it's like, I don't know. That example, as I say, of the sort of 11-year-old discovering just the most out there kind of shit as the beginning of, their visual introduction to sexuality. It's sort of like...
Look, I totally... And look, I don't know the answer to this. I totally agree with you in that, and particularly, it's interesting because I find straight porn horrific in the way that women are...
It's very angry.
It absolutely. And I don't understand... where it comes from, and I've stopped watching it just because it's just... And I tell you what's really interesting...
what are you doing watching it in the first place?
Well, hey,
We'll get to number 23. Okay.
Yeah, no, and look, there's all sorts of... But it's very interesting because there was a wonderful film called... what's it? It's I can't remember the name of it now. It's about two lesbian who have some children.
And the guy comes along and... Is it a fictional film?
Yeah.
We're talking about the same film.
Yeah.
Kind of a cool guy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And it's a relationship with the children. Yeah. That's the core of the film. But in it, there's a wonderful scene where the couple start watching gay male porn.
I do remember that.
And you think, hang on a sec, why are lesbians watching gay male porn? And I spoke to my producer in London, who's a very dear and close friend and is also, a gay woman. And she said, absolutely, it's a thing that a lot of gay women like. And I said, why? And she sort of said, well, weirdly, it's partly because gay male porn has more emotion in it than straight porn. And
isn't there lesbian porn made for lesbians, surely?
There is, but...
I saw a great... Would be Vice or something like that had a great video of lesbians reacting to lesbian porn made for straight men.
Oh, God. I don't know why we're getting onto porn as a major subject and all this, but anyhow...
Well, actually, I just got... Because you were cutting out money shots from your...
That's right, that's right.
And then I was going to, graciously segue from there into your... Film career. Because you made a number of feature films in the UK. You also worked for Discovery Channel and History Channel. How do these things open up to you? And because as I said before, London eats people up. So it's very easy not to just go on the path you intended.
Look, alongside, obviously 100 Men was about, being gay and sex and what have you. But, alongside that, London opened up in a whole range of other ways. And I was, I worked as an assistant editor and met some wonderful directors and worked in a television company and slowly gained, I guess, some sort of skill and eventually ended up working for a quite successful current affairs company. And as you say, did a whole range of amazing documentaries. And I was just privileged to meet fantastic people and work on just an incredible range of history.
Editing for a lot of that stuff.
Editing and then directing. As I became more experienced, I got work as a director. and just worked on, lots and lots of different fascinating things, political programs, history programs. I did a whole series of news specials for Channel 5 and worked with really talented people. I mean, it was just, and it's an industry that, I still think, God, I'm so lucky to be paid for doing something that.
Well, that means you've picked the right career, man.
Yeah, I mean, look, and it's hard because you get lots of rejections and it's not steady work, and but at the same time, the plus is that it's always something new, and the opportunity to engage in other worlds, other people's problems, explore them has just been, and it's been a fantastic. I've loved every minute of it.
And you got some New Zealand-based projects while you're over there as well. How did that come about? Because I read it. It sounded like you never came back the whole time you were away.
I did obviously visit the folks and back. So I came back for Christmases, pretty regularly.
Oh, okay.
And
okay.
I
opposite of what I thought. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, within reason. I mean, I never intended to come back, but I kept in touch with the mentor I mentioned, Jeff Stephen, and he became sort of head honcho at, I think, TV3 initially and then TVNZ, and was very instrumental in a lot of early television, particularly television work here. He did some feature films as well, but I think, documentary filmmaking in New Zealand was very much down to his work at first TV3, and he had a documentary series Inside New Zealand, I think it was called.
That was a great series.
Yeah, and that was, I think, and he asked me, in fact, he suggested I do a documentary on the Big OE, which is how I did the first thing for him, and that was, again, even doing that, it was funny because I'd been in England for 15, 20 years and not had much to do with Kiwis other than...
I never went to the Redback or did any of that.
What was the you talking about, the big club at...
just the whole...
The King's Cross,
Just the whole, speaking of being completely out Kiwi while you're over there,
How long were you in?
Not long, 6-8 months, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I had the opposite. I sort of struggled to find work. I should have hung on a bit longer. But had a reasonably big New Year's, had people saying they were in Melbourne having a good time, and I think I had this return ticket and jumped to go to Melbourne and then come back. And someone said to me, it won't happen.
It's quite... I mean...
I sort of regretted it a little.
London...
It was amazing. It's just an incredible place.
It's an incredible place. It's quite hard to get... I think you do have to struggle. For the first year, if I'd had the money, I probably would have come back.
Humility is a word I reflect on. I was not humble enough at the time.
It was. I struggled for the first year.
Yeah.
It was a very hard place to get used to. It's not an instant city.
Yeah.
And I guess it's partly because of the gay thing that allowed me to make friends, get inside, and actually I moved. I didn't have anything to do with that whole Big OE. I mean, I never went to any of the places.
Yeah.
I didn't actually have Kiwi friends over there, other than the odd school friend who decided it was a cheap place to crash when he came over, or she came over. But it was interesting because, as I said, I had nothing to do with that Kiwi world of travellers and, clubs or pubs and the houses with 20 people living in them, and the whole sort of Kentucky tour thing. And then Jeff suggested I should do a doco, and I just literally went and researched it and discovered this whole sort of Kiwiana OE.
What era? When did you do it?
It was I guess late,
like sort of 90s, 80s?
Early 90s probably. Early 90s, and it was screened down here, and it was a lovely, interesting little documentary in which we followed a bunch of Kiwis travelling around. They travelled. We went with them to France, and it was fascinating.
And you did a lot of work for Channel 4, and I had no idea till I watched the doco that Channel's actually got quite radical roots in a lot of ways in terms of. Because you started making pretty much, sort of silo stuff, but gay programming, didn't you?
Yeah, no, it was...
Which was being broadcast to all and sundry in the UK.
Yeah, look, it was very much, arrived at an exciting time, 1979, and then, spent 2-3 years working as assistant editor and learning my craft. And then Channel 4 was literally launched in 1981 to go on air in 1982.
Yeah.
I think I've got my dates right. No, I have.
I remember it being early 80s.
Yeah, no, it was 82. And it was very much, I mean, they put out press releases saying we want to make programs for people who are not being served, and there'd been very little. There was a couple of very early documentaries the BBC, and we had a little excerpt of one of them had made, about the gay experience. But these were almost like, nature programs. David Attenborough was
that cracked me up in the film.
Yeah.
I thought it was line, the homosexual male, or
That's
something
right.
like that.
But that was very much the sort of like, these strange people that exist in this netherworld, and we're going to explore them as a sort
under
of
glass
species.
in museums.
Yeah. But that was sort of like, and that was considered daring.
Yeah.
I mean, that was considered daring.
Yeah.
There'd been, I think, an attempt to do something which was regional. LWT had done a little series looking at gay life, but again, that was very much sort of, let's look at the strange, sort of, it was from the outside. They'd never, and we proposed, I rang Channel 4 and just said, hey, what about something for gay people? And they said, look, we haven't had anything. Nothing's been submitted.
Right.
And we'd love
so
something.
This is you moving into directing out of the editing.
Yes,
Yeah.
it indeed. And in fact, it was interesting that because I didn't feel confident to direct it. So my role on that particular program, we were commissioned to do a program for the launch of Channel 4, which weirdly was called 1 in 5, which was based on adverts in Time Out. Right. It was the wrong title, but I've since learnt the importance of titles. But I didn't have the confidence to direct it, so in fact I got an experienced BBC director who was openly gay and part of the early gay rights movement, a guy called Ken Howard, and invited him. We put together a sort of consortium, and it was interesting because I plunged without any real knowledge. I think about the naivety of youth allows you to do things that, I think if I knew what I know now, I probably wouldn't have tried half the things I've tried.
Some great stuff's come of that historically.
It gets harder when you sort of, as you get older, you know how tough it is. You sort of think, oh God, do I really want to go through all this again?
I find it's even stepping out of the house more terrifying than I did 20 or 30 years ago.
Absolutely, yeah.
But in other words, so you bit off more than you could chew, but you didn't realise it, and you got it done.
Yeah, but it was also plunging into a world that I hadn't been involved in all the political infighting, and which goes on even to this day with gay pride here in Auckland, up in arms over all sorts of things. But I put together, phone Channel 4. They said, please send us something. So I then got in touch with the great and the good of what I perceived as the sort of gay political movement, which in those days were all sorts of activists. Not knowing about, and interestingly, there was, I can remember being, quite rightly we had to have gay women, and I can remember suddenly being sort of faced in the office by a, lesbian separatist feminist who demanded editorial control of all sort of, and I was just, the thing became a huge...
Every scene's got their politics, man.
Yeah, and it became an enormous controversy in the gay press before then appearing when it was announced. And again, suddenly, I remember sitting on the tube and seeing a headline in the Daily Mail, Channel 4 being attacked by MPs. I think, oh God, what have they done now? I better buy this and have a look at it.
Were you on the front page?
And I was on the front page.
Shit.
Paul Oremland, admitted homosexual, 25... says...
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, because that was my next question. Is probably fairly obvious one to ask, but releasing this kind of programming available to all in the UK in 1982. Speaking of someone who's come up before in Thatcher's Britain, a hard road initially.
It was naive. To be honest with you, we were off just making our program, and I was more concerned about the infighting within the gay world. Yeah, and Channel 4 were brilliant. For 2 days, we were front page headlines. The phone didn't stop ringing, people wanting quotes, and then the whole thing went away. Obviously, the end result was that the program, which was,
people watched it.
People watched it, and it put us on the map. Yeah. So, but it wasn't. It was just part of that sort of, swirling world. And in a way, it was the first of a kind. I also then went on... Was
homosexuality even legal in the UK then?
Yeah.
It wasn't in New Zealand until 86, was it?
That's correct. No, it was very much legal. It'd been made legal in 1967. Yeah, 1967. But it was still very underground. It hadn't... it was still very taboo. There were aspects of it that were still illegal. It was very limited, the legality. There were all sorts.
I mean, it's evident by looking at any footage of the UK in general. Indeed, New Zealand around that time. Hardly unsurprising. Something else that I thought of based on what you said with the radical anarcho lesbian. Trying to kneecap you in the office.
I mean, they were quite right. I didn't know absolutely anything about the politics, which is probably they were right.
Here's me on the outside looking in. I've pondered: is it useful putting LBGT in one kind of amorphous blob, or is that? You don't have. Sorry, maybe that is.
No, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah,
I've not been.
Just because I don't know. But if there are sort of not cliches, but the lesbian couples I've met are often very different in a lot of ways to the gay couples I've met, and I don't know.
Not to mention trans and
absolutely. Yeah.
Look, I'll get myself into hot water here.
That's why I just saw your response. I'm like, we can edit this out.
Look, it's a really interesting question, and I mean, the Rainbow Coalition and all of that. I think. And where does one draw the line? Bisexuality, which I think is a really unexplored area and really does exist.
Yeah. Sheffield.
Well, and Auckland and, and everybody, I mean, I think people like labels.
Yeah.
People like labels. I personally think there is a danger, but at the same time, there's also... there are overlaps. And in some ways...
Good for maybe general awareness and acceptance from quote-unquote outsiders.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what we were saying before about being an outsider. There's a sort of awareness and tolerance of other issues. It's interesting coming back to New Zealand, and I've done a lot of work for programs on Maori TV and worked, with journalists here. I did a big series for Maori TV called Mediatake, working with Russell Brown and Toy.
Yeah.
And suddenly I could relate to the language of minorities, even, around, race-based things. And that was partly because, as a gay man growing up through all sorts of, political changes. And so, in a way, there are overlaps and there's a shared, sense of community that exists.
I get that totally, yeah.
And I think there are political aims that you can sort of, relate to.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think they are very different experiences, and it's wrong to try and lump them all together.
So, how did you get Roger Daltrey in your film?
Sent his agent the script.
Right. He's not even one. He's not. He's acted occasionally throughout time, hasn't he?
Yes, absolutely. And look, he was wonderful. I mean, we literally, this was for a film that I was struggling to get off the ground, and his presence helped. And
Like It Is, I've got it here in 1988.
That's right.
Yeah.
And and in its own way, that was something probably one of the things that I'm most proud of as a filmmaker. And, we sent the script to his agent. The agent said, look, he's looking for sort of low-key things, but also he was a wonderful guy. His manager way back in the early days had been gay and I think had struggled with it. So he was very aware of the issues, and really he's a huge star and one was aware of it, but he was just fabulous to work with and incredibly supportive. He did it for basic equity and...
Had you thought about that? Did he help bring an audience just by virtue of his name?
Not really, because, they're different worlds. I don't think Who fans would particularly have enjoyed a film about a gay bare-knuckle fighter.
Who was one of that which is inspired from one of the 100 in the film?
Yeah, that was one of the most powerful. It was.
Did you track him down again? I can't remember.
No, it would have been impossible. I mean, right. it and in fact, it happened. I think I don't know if I described it in the film, but I literally was in Blackpool and came out of the club and met this scrawny kid who asked me back, and on the way back, he told me he fought for and it was a very strange and powerful evening, and we started to have sex and he freaked out, and then we spent the rest of the evening as he discussed there was a lot more than was both in the film and
Sure, I got the sense the way you cut that together as well.
Yeah, no, he was,
story.
He'd been in the forces, and he was obviously, clearly Catholic, and wanted to know whether I thought suicide was, wrong. And it was a powerful night, and he showed me little videos of him fighting, and, it was the real deal. And I wish, in a way, I'd love to have heard from him again, and I hope, that he maybe made it. I suspect, who knows? And there's no way of tracking it down.
God, that he made it. Yeah, right. So that's late 80s, and you sort of, the way you framed it to me before, it sounds like you were making it for a gay audience, and it found an audience in the UK and the US. Is that right?
This is 100 Men, or Like It Is? Like It Is. Yeah, very much so. I mean, that was made, and in a way that was, it was interesting because we made it for Channel 4 put a little bit of money in. It was made on a shoestring budget, like most independent gay films. And in those days, it was great.
Most independent films.
Most independent films, indeed. And in those days, it was quite. It was well received. It did a lot of festivals, but just amongst the gay audience, and it was seen as a gay film. It was. I remember at the time we screened it to one of the big studios. I can't remember if it was Fox or one of the big studios, and they said, "Look, we like this, but we want to put a bit more money in it, and we want to take out the sex scenes."
Yeah, but they were still willing to release.
No, it was all independent. We said no to the sex scenes being taken out, and they weren't that graphic. I hasten to add.
Yeah.
By today's standard, you'd see.
But it still would have been a clearly.
It was clearly a gay. It was a gay film. A gay film. Yeah, and look, this is the thing that I go, and it's interesting talking to you. On a podcast like this.
The most famous kind of quote-unquote gay film I know is probably that one that Robin Williams was in,
Birdcage?
Yeah, Birdcage. Brokeback Mountain, yeah.
Well, I mean, Birdcage was based on a much La Cage aux Folles, which is much better the original, though Birdcage is very good and Robin Williams is fantastic. But, it was a remake of I think, there's been some great stuff done outside the mainstream, some great, foreign films that have explored the gay experience. But there is this whole thing of crossover, which is interesting. But I've always believed that, not everything has to conform, and one should explore the issues honestly and openly. And you can only really do that amongst people who can understand, and
it's got to find its audience.
It's got to find its audience, but also there are things that you can't talk about. And it was even a problem in 100 Men, which was funded by the Film Commission. There was a US who put a little bit of money into it, and they wanted something that could be seen in a wide context. So as a result of that, I'm not talking about sex so much, but I mean there's a whole lot of deep issues that.
I found them very societal. I mean, there's probably a bunch of stuff in there that I didn't relate to.
But there's also things I couldn't explore.
I think you approached it well.
Thank you.
Right.
I would have liked to have gone further in things that, and I think perhaps in
perhaps I received it more fully because of what you felt had to.
That's right, and it wouldn't alienate a broader audience.
Yeah.
But I think there are a lack of forums, and particularly films that, and it didn't cross over. We never got into mainstream world. I mean, it got into the New Zealand Film Festival, but it didn't, it got onto Netflix, which is amazing. So in a way, it's worked on that level, and it has explored things. But I think, and possibly in literature, one can go much further because it's a more niche. And I think there are films that are exploring things, but they really very rarely. And these are issues that, and this is what you asked about, the umbrella LGBT. I think it's important to be able to push within the community in things that you understand. I haven't expressed that very well, but you understand what I mean.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Something just cracked me up was I was thinking right at the beginning you were talking about how terrified you were that you had to be in front of the camera. How was sitting at a New Zealand International Film Festival screening, watching your life play out on screen in a room full of people?
It was,
I would imagine a lot of emotions.
Look, it was... it was slightly scary. The film had been screened in
the Out Festival,
Los Angeles Out Fest, and I went to that, and that was the first public screening, and that was petrifying because the first screening of a film to an audience is petrifying. We'd also had a test screening here, which the Film Commission organised, which was interesting. Yeah, it was scary, and as a filmmaker, I'm never happy with things. So for me, it's just painful to watch anything at any point.
That sounds like a typical creator's response.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
You notice the 1.3 seconds that should have
and more. And I wish and you just say, right, abandon. Let's get on with the. No film's finished. They're always abandoned. And you just get on to the next one.
What is it? Are you working on anything yourself?
Yes.
At the minute? Are you allowed to?
Yeah. Look, there's nothing secret. You can, it's a bit late to have secrets, I think.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the reasons I've been dealing with the Film Commission, and in a way, the 100 Men was almost a byproduct. I've been struggling for the last 10 years to get a film off the ground, and I continue to struggle. It's called Miracle, and it's about a vicar, Anglican vicar, who wants to marry his Samoan boyfriend in the church. Yeah. The Anglicans don't allow it, so God comes to the rescue.
Interesting. And where are we at with it?
Draft 220.
So you're the screenwriter as well?
Co-screenwriter. I've been working with a very successful Samoan playwright called Diana Fumana, and we've gone through numerous drafts. We've been rejected by the Film Commission, left, right and centre, but we continue to fight with them, and I've got some overseas people that I'm talking to, and I will just keep fighting to get the film made, because that's all I know. How, you just got to... getting anything off the ground is, and often it happens by accident. 100 Men was an accident. I mean, it was just, it happened really the result of another film that was very successful commercially, and they thought maybe this was going to be successful commercially, but...
somehow related?
There was a film called Tickled, which was very successful, and
we're throwing money at esoteric New Zealand documentaries,
things that could be things that could be considered controversial. And
now, wasn't that that was such a trying to think how to put it. Like, obviously, what David set out to make and the story that unfolded in front of him was so strange that I actually thought maybe I was getting fooled a la Banksy X at the gift shop. And I did a bunch of reading after I finished watching that to make sure that I wasn't being trolled.
Yeah. Look, it was I think it was partly also, it was zeitgeist in terms of when he made it. I mean, there's been a whole series of not crime genre, but those sort of documentaries making a murderer, things like that. And he, caught, it was an interesting story, well told, and it just caught the public imagination. I think it was screened at Sundance and picked up by HBO, I think. And in a way, there was an American distributor sales company who had done well with it, and they said, got anything else controversial floating around? They didn't realise what 100 Men was, I think, and in some ways, they've been wonderfully supportive despite that, and they've recognised its value as a gay piece of work. But
you've seen Tickled, right?
Yes, of course.
I think hilarious now is all that sort of entourage that he had around him. Their paranoia of the gay David Ferrier. They must think this island is
full of puffters.
Actually, now I've asked a number of people, well, actually a couple of others who've had content that's ended up on Netflix. This is an area that interests me because I worry that once the whole planet's subscribed to Netflix, we're going to lose local stories. When I teach, kind of media ponderances to my students, I sort of talk about,
the importance.
Well, what language do you want your kids growing up hearing? Anyway, so I've gone a bit broad and lofty there. Essentially, how did you get your film onto Netflix?
Look, that was partly through the involvement.
I mean, that's fantastic.
It is, and it allows the film. I mean, it's been great because it means that the audience that are interested in the film get the chance to see it, which I'm thrilled about. I mean, it wasn't, we got paid for it, but nobody's made money out of it. It was a sort of, it wasn't huge money. Contrary to the belief, Netflix doesn't pay fortunes for everything. No. So it has.
I'd imagine it's like streaming music where you go, woohoo, I've got my $1.64 check.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But for me, it's just great that so many people can see it. In answer to your question, and look, my film is on Netflix, and I love Netflix. I live on Netflix and a few other things that I managed to find elsewhere. And I think it's a golden age of television at the
absolutely.
moment. It's just incredible. But I also think one of the things that's fantastic is that one, through Netflix, is able to see things that are being made locally. And there's a whole range of things, whether it's this, wonderful German Babylon Berlin, or there's a thing called Occupied from Norway, which is just amazing. I watched an incredible thing, 4 seasons from Havana, made by Spanish TV. There's just loads of... So on the one hand, you're seeing on Netflix things from all over the world that you wouldn't normally see. Yeah. At the same time, Netflix are also putting money into local
That's good.
programs. I mean, a lot of these things, like the not necessarily Occupied, but I believe the Four Tales from Havana, there was Netflix money going into.
I see. I'm a little bit of a cynic, but that's great news. Where I am a cynic is that I see, they are a business. They do have huge amounts of investors to make right now with the amount they've been spending. Yeah. So I suspect they've obviously thought about this as a concern that will come out of different countries, and so it's great that it's really great that they're doing that. Though.
I mean,
because as a cold-hearted business model, there's no way they would have done that. They just keep pumping out British and American content.
Yeah, but I think they're savvy, and I think they really are. I mean, they put money.
That's what I'm meaning. They can read the social tide,
and also the fact that people like to see their own. I mean, people like to see themselves represented. I mean, that's me. What's fueled me as a filmmaker over the years, and I think that Netflix recognised that in order to stay competitive. I mean, the danger is that their power is going to swamp local. The local broadcaster, but when they do it in conjunction with, and just right now, New Zealand On Air have just put out a major tender document looking for something that's going to hit the international market. They want to compete, and that will be trying to do stuff with
big providers,
providers, whether it's Amazon or Netflix.
I'll tell you who's done really well locally. And I hope it works out for them, because people do go to a Netflix or whatever as a one-size-fits-all, but the TVNZ On Demand stuff's really good at the moment. Really good.
Yeah.
And that's streets ahead of anyone else locally. And there's indie stuff, web-only stuff.
Look, I caught the, is it Ken Burns, the Vietnam documentary on New Zealand On Demand, and it's an amazing
5 or
documentary.
6 hour documentary or something, isn't
absolutely.
it?
And there weren't even adverts at that point. I think they probably put them in now. But
speaking to you when you were, at the beginning of your film and storytelling career, there's some students from my school getting little web series and stuff on there. Look, if you can find an audience, it's like Netflix. If you can find the audience there, they'll put it up.
Yeah, and
put it the other way around.
Absolutely. And look, the bottom line is, the important thing is, find an audience, but also, tell good stories honestly with great characters, and that applies. I remember years ago I did a documentary. I love science fiction. I did a documentary on science fiction. And I was privileged to interview a very famous director, Robert Wise, who, would you believe, he was in his 80s, I think, at the time, or late 70s. Just an amazing guy. He was the editor of Citizen Kane.
Wow. And, holy shit. It's like one of the...
I know. And he was also, he had something like 8 Oscars or 6 Oscars. Yeah. He was the producer of Sound of Music, director of West Side Story. I mean, just, and he was so gracious and lovely. This is, we were talking to him about, it was a thing called The Day the Earth Stood Still, a very famous 50s film he'd made.
Yeah.
At the time.
The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Yeah. At the time it was groundbreaking. Badly remade subsequently. Yeah. But, and I remember asking him at the time, now they're perhaps dated, but there were special effects that were considered important. Yeah. And I remember asking him about it, and he just looked at me and he said, look, special effects, forget it. It's icing on the cake. It's unimportant. The only thing, and his eyes lit up, he said, the only thing that's important is characters and a great story.
And connection. And
that's all that matters. You get that right, everything else is ice. And and I'll never forget that. This is Robert Wise.
Which is really, broadly speaking, the issue with mainstream cinema at the moment compared to what you speak of coming out of places like Netflix. It's almost like there's a paradigm shift there for what TV used to offer to what cinema used to offer. I didn't realise until recently one of the reasons the studios are encouraging those sort of big superhero films and stuff is there's a huge market in China now. I don't mean that Chinese people like shit films. That's ridiculous.
And
I'm meaning that the language. I'm meaning that if you want an international audience, bombastic special effects, violence, explosions.
And the odd superhero film at times. You occasionally sort of there's the odd one that works. Or there's nothing wrong with the art. I mean, who was it? There was Bill Maher recently attacked. He said Stan Lee sort of said, "Oh, what did he really give? This is why." And I don't agree. Superhero films have their place.
Oh no, it wasn't dissing superhero films. We were just talking about. Oh goodness, this is going to go terrible. Right?
No, please not.
So I think we already covered this. I sort of was going to ask about what I sort of called the analog connection versus the sort of digital world we live in, and I think we already talked about whether you think that's changing the gay experience. And we sort of talked about bars and clubs closing down and stuff. But another thing that struck me in that film is, do you think they're partying like we did back then? Well, we did back then, being my era sort of being 90s, early 2000s, but. Yeah.
Well, this brings us to, and I'm on a podcast, so let's be honest. I think being brutal, the drugs have changed.
Yeah.
And, for me, ecstasy, as I say in the film, a bit of dope, ecstasy, that was great fun. I'm not a fan of, P or whatever they call it. It's a harsh, nasty drug, and, it just doesn't... I don't know. I mean, I want to be careful here because people always say, "Oh, it was better back in the day,"
ecstasy disappeared because there was a global crackdown on. I never knew it came from an organic compound. I thought it was totally chemists produced, but
I didn't know
it's
this.
derived from sassafras oil. Okay,
I didn't know this.
In the war on drugs, this is verified. I didn't read it on. I did do my fact checking. I am an academic at heart. They had a crackdown on people illegally harvesting sassafras oil, and the way you get sassafras oil is kind of similar to maple syrup, I believe, but. I think early 2000s, probably mid 2000s to however long later, maybe 10 years. That was the reason there was no real MDMA round, or very little, on the planet.
Right.
And then a Dutch pharmacist I don't know if I get my dates right now, about 5 or 6 years ago, figured out how to completely make it in a laboratory. And now there is, again, some of the strongest MDMA available around again.
Right.
So I'm told.
Yes. I mean,
it's actually literally so I'm told.
Yeah. Look, partying, I don't know.
Reaches ahead, either way.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I loved partying once upon a time in London. I mean, never too over the top, because I've always worked hard and I've always wanted to, keep it together to get up and, get on with the next film. But I think, people have always partied, go back. Ancient times, people have partied, and gay men party. It's different. They don't have the responsibilities of family so much. That's changed a little bit, but by and large, there's still, it's a hedonistic lifestyle. And to quote somebody in 100 Men, I've had a ball, and it's fun, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No. A couple of sort of deeper ponderances before we go. Things are never completely rosy, and you talk in the film about how far we've come as a society, acceptance-wise, and so on. How does homophobia still manifest itself now?
Oh, another interesting question.
Yeah, I think it's important.
I think it goes back to that imposition of your worldview or values, the sort of, it's not overt, it's not the hatred that once existed. And I think one of the biggest changes, trying to think positive, is that one can have a conversation like we are having, friendships, the people I work with, even at work. I remember just the other day, I was chatting away, and I was actually almost not flirting, but I was, as a gay man, making jokes about my straight colleague's appearance. He'd shaved his beard off, and I didn't notice. And I said, "Oh my God, I'm a gay man. I didn't even notice your beard's gone." You know, and he laughed.
Yeah.
And that would have been unthinkable.
Feeling comfortable to do that, and not even thinking about. Me feeling comfortable to say it, him laughing, and
having genuine friendships. Doing editing this program, I edited with, although my background's editing, it was too close, and I had to bring in an outside editor, and I brought in Stuart Boone, who was just a very experienced and wonderful editor, totally straight, and we had one of the most joyful, I think the highlight for me making 100 Men was the editing, where we'd end up having hilarious conversations about, you know, sex, life, drugs, the meaning of everything, in a way that was without any fear. So things are fantastic. In answer to your question, because I've gone off the topic, I
think you've opened up the topic really well by discussing the very positive. Yeah.
The negative is, I think, to go back to what I tried to explore in the doco, in that it's this idea of, now that we're acceptable, there is the expectation that our lives are going to match, you know, the heteronormative, whatever the word is, and that pride in being an outsider isn't available, and as a result of that, you know, one is almost going back to the hiding and feeling the need to, you know, conform, I guess, and that's the worry, you know.
You're making me think of the gay couple on every reality show these days. Yeah, you know, I can't even think of names of shows. But that's fascinating. I mean, the experience is so hugely different. And I mean, just to give you an idea, and it's interesting, you know, the original 100 Men, people, you know, the backers sort of said, "Oh, this is very controversial." The original, did it have an edit after?
No. These are the, you know, when they were commissioning it.
Yes.
They sort of said, "Oh, this is very controversial," and they sort of said, "Well, you know, how many people have you had sex with?" Well, I used to go out, you know, most weekends, not during the week because I worked.
Yeah.
And there are people who did it, you know, weekends as well as weeks. But and I would, you know, go clubbing, go to the saunas. I would maybe, you know, meet somebody Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So, you know, 3 people a week for 40 years. Yeah. You do the maths.
Yeah.
It's thousands. And I am not untypical. That's the interesting thing. I'm not actually even more, you know, I've never...
That's funny. That was going to be pretty much my last question.
I'm not, you know, and as I said, I'm not suggesting this is a good thing, and I never set out.
Well, I think I like that about the film. It's not about putting a trying to think of the word, you know, a moral judgment on it. It's just, here's a snapshot of my life. Here are these people. And here's some wider issues.
You know, and in a way, I wish in some ways, you know, there are a number of on that list, or not on that list, but on, you know, in the bigger list that I wish I hadn't met, perhaps. And, you know, you thought,
that's life.
Yeah, that's life. But I just think, you know, everyone's different, and I think it's important to, you know, enjoy and explore the world. And your question about the future, for me, it was about exploring the world, and I just think, you know, young people need to explore the world with pride and confidence, whatever their sexuality, you know, politics, or even religion.
Absolutely. So, hey, it's been fascinating. It's been a great chat. Very entertaining. You gave me a screener, but sometimes stuff has got that weird geo-blocking malarkey on Netflix, so people can watch 100 Men on New Zealand Netflix?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. It's on Netflix, definitely.
Thanks so much for coming in, Paul. We'll have this up in a jiffy.
Oh, it's been a fascinating, unexpected pleasure, so thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Cheers.